The Ways of Mental Prayer by the Right Reverend Dom Lehodey. Part 1. Preface. Saint Alphonsus relates that Saint Teresa would have wished to ascend to the top of a high mountain and be able to make her voice heard around the whole world, for the sole purpose of crying out to it, "Pray, pray, pray." She had rightly understood the words our Lord addresses to each of us. We ought to pray and not to faint. In the spiritual life, there are two great principles which should never be forgotten. Without grace we can do nothing. With it we can do all things. Sometimes it anticipates our desires. Ordinarily, God waits till we ask for it. This is a general law thus expressed by our Lord. Ask, and it shall be given to you. Prayer is, therefore, not only a precept, it is a necessity. God places the treasure of His graces at our disposal, and its key is prayer. You desire more faith, more hope, more love? Ask, and it shall be given to you. Your good resolutions remain sterile, resulting always in the same failures. Ask, and it shall be given to you. Precepts are numerous, virtue painful, temptation seductive, the enemy ruthless, and the will weak. Ask, and it shall be given to you. Prayer will draw down into your soul the omnipotence of God. It is stronger than all the demons. But I pray and I do not obtain. It is because you ask amiss. I have been asking now for a long time. Ask again. Seek, knock. Reanimate your desires. Importune heaven. Make the voice of your soul loud and shrill as a piercing cry, and provided that your prayer possesses the necessary conditions, you shall ask whatever you will, and it shall be done unto you. The Master of Grace, truth itself, has pledged His word for it, a promise supremely encouraging. The only reproach He makes us is that we do not ask enough. A promise, too, which leaves faint-heartedness no excuse. For we can always pray, and nothing is easier. The mind remains without light, because it does not draw nigh to God. The heart is dried up because the soul has forgotten to eat her bread. And the will is hard as iron, and resists grace because we have neglected to heat it in the fire of prayer. This is the doctrine which St. Augustine preaches. The body is nourished by material food, and the interior man by prayer. St. Chrysostom declares with not less energy, as the body cannot live without the soul, so the soul without prayer is dead and fetid. And St. Lehodey gives us this memorable admonition. He who prays shall certainly be saved. He who does not pray shall certainly be damned. The ordinary Christian must have recourse to prayer in order to fulfill his duties and to conquer temptation. Much more must a religious give himself to it, for, in addition to the ordinary precepts, he has to observe his vows and his rules, and has bound himself to tend to perfection by ever seeking to die to self, and so to advance ever in virtue and in holy love. Such an experience, the noblest and most fruitful of all, but also the most elevated above the reach of human weakness, requires a broad and continuous flow of graces, and consequently a superabundance of prayer. Besides, is it not meek and just that a soul consecrated to God should seek the presence and the conversation of her divine spouse? This is true for even the active religious orders. How much more is it so for a contemplative order like ours, all whose observances are ordained with a view to a life of prayer? None have so many motives and means as we, to make us conceive an affection for prayer, give ourselves to it with love, and seek, above all things, union with God. The world, alas, absorbed by its pursuits and its pleasures, hardly ever thinks of God. Martha, overburdened with the pious labors to which she devotes herself all day long in the service of God and of souls, has but little leisure for repose and contemplation. Our vocation is that of Mary, who, keeping at our Lord's feet, looks upon him, loves him, listens to him, and speaks to him. Our function in the house of God is to be attached to the person of our divine Master, to have frequent and familiar intercourse with him, to be united to him in a life of prayer. We are contemplatives by the peculiar duties of our profession. Can any lot be more sweet or more desirable? It is true that we are also penitents, but penance and contemplation are, so far as we are concerned, as closely connected as our two eyes or our two hands. We have need of one, and we cannot do without the other. They are like the two tables of law. It is impossible for us to please God without our austerities, and not less impossible to be acceptable to him without our life of prayer. And, of course, it is not enough to give to God only the half of what we have promised. There are the two wings which can raise us from earth and bear us aloft to God, but only by acting in harmony and lending each other mutual support. Penance, by its fasts, watchings, toils, and, above all, by interior mortification, detaches the soul from all things and allows her to raise herself freely towards God by contemplation, the life of prayer. In its turn, inflames us with zeal for penance, and at times, in the hour of dryness and sterility, it may itself be not the least of our sacrifices. These are two sisters who live together in perfect concord, and do not want to be separated. Penance, assuredly, is noble and fruitful. Contemplation is incomparably more beautiful, richer, and happier. The former tears us painfully away from earth, the latter unites us to God. Of all the ways which obedience opens up to us to lead us to God, the shortest, the easiest, and the most certain is a life of prayer. Our life may be very penitential, at least corporally, and yet not be by any means perfect. But no one can be courageously and perseveringly a man of prayer without becoming a saint. Faith, hope, charity, humility, all the virtues bloom easily in prayer, and there are in turn developed. A single outburst of the heart may even express them all at one time, and it is the best exercise of perfection. And when one's prayer is ended, for prayer is not the only duty even in the life of a monk, we remain enlightened by faith and rich in graces, which enable us to act supernaturally, to suffer with fruit, to correct our faults, to grow in virtue, and to do whatever God wills. During our actions we will be in touch with God, because prayer shall have filled our mind and our heart with Him. Thus it was that 40 days' conversation with the Lord upon the holy mountain left upon the brow of Moses 2 rays of light. The presence of God, with which he was filled within, being reflected upon his countenance, and doubtless also in his words and works. Such ought we ourselves to be, angels at prayer and men of God in our conduct. St. Peter of Alcantara strongly reproves those who, after having experienced the inestimable advantages of prayer, and recognize that the whole conduct of their spiritual life depends upon it, take it into their heads that prayer alone is everything, and give way to relaxation in all other duties. For all the other virtues act as a support to prayer, and, if this foundation happens to be wanting, the whole edifice must fall. When an instrument is played upon, it is not a single string, but several sounding together, which produces the harmony. A clock stops altogether if a single piece only of the mechanism is out of order. Thus, too, the spiritual life cannot get on if a single wheel be wanting, whether that wheel be prayer or works. Prayer should, therefore, nourish us in faith, hope, and charity, develop the other virtues, and effectually tend to make us grow in holiness. This is its end, and by this we can judge whether our prayer is well made, and whether we devote enough time to prayer. Bodily health requires that nutriment. Work and rest should bear a due proportion to each other. So, too, sanctity demands that the soul be nourished in prayer, should labor at acquiring virtues, and should have rest in God, who is found in prayer. We know that the body has all it wants, when it can do its work sufficient without difficulty. And the interior man is sufficiently nourished by prayer when he shows vigor in cultivating virtue, bearing trials, and making sacrifices. On the contrary, if he has lost his strength and his energy, it is food that he wants. He requires to pray more or to pray better. In the beginning of this work on mental prayer, we deemed it well to remind our readers of the necessity of prayer in general, and of the supremely important part it plays in the work of our sanctification. If we wish to describe all the exercises of the contemplative life, it would have been sufficient to annotate the short but solid treatise, which our Holy Father St. Bernard, or rather some other author, has composed on this subject so full of interest for us. One day, when engaged in manual work, he began to reflect upon the exercises of the spiritual man, and 4 degrees suddenly presented themselves to his mind: reading, meditation, the prayer of petition and contemplation. Here we have the ladder of the dwellers of the cloister, by means of which they ascend from earth to heaven. Reading seeks the sweetness of the beatific life, meditation finds it, prayer asks for it, contemplation tastes it. Seek by reading, and you shall find by meditation. Knock by prayer, and the door shall be opened to you by contemplation. This would certainly be an interesting study, but very long and too complex for a single treatise. We refer our readers, therefore, for information concerning our other exercises of piety to the director, which treats sufficiently of them, and in order not to extend that work already too long, we thought it better to treat, in this separate work, of mental prayer, and of all the developments so grave a subject implies. Mental prayer is, in fact, the soul of the contemplative life. It is this exercise which fertilizes, animates, and renders 10 times more efficacious all our other means of attaining to union with God. Without this, the divine office, which occupies so considerable a portion of our day, and in which the same expressions so continually recur, would run some risk of producing a mere system of routine, distracting thoughts, disgust and weariness. But when once the fire of meditation has inflamed the heart, the Holy Liturgy is no longer a dead letter. It speaks to our mind and heart, and everything in us sings praises of God. So, likewise, without the hunger after God derived from mental prayer, spiritual reading is frigid and almost unfruitful. With it, spiritual books move us and not merely shed their light upon the intellect, but make it penetrate even to the depths of the heart and of the will. Nothing is more powerful than the holy sacrifice of the sacraments, yet even they never produce so much fruit as when fervent prayer has thrown the doors of the soul wide open to the effusions of grace. A life of prayer it is, which raises a religious above the paltry thoughts of earth and the pitiful cares of nature. This it is, which establishes us in God, and makes us live in recollection and watchfulness over ourselves. This it is, which communicates to us the supernatural spirit of devotion, thus vivifying all fasts, our watchings, our manual labors, and all our works. Without it, our observances, admirably conceived though they be, would run the risk of becoming a body without a soul. Since, then, mental prayer is so vital an element in our contemplative life, we ought to esteem it, to love it, and to apply ourselves to it with a holy ardor. But it is a divine art, and by no means one of the easiest to acquire. Beginners require to learn a method of prayer, just as even the most intelligent apprentice must be initiated into the secrets of his trade. They will find it useful to know the various processes which may serve as substitutes for meditation, in order not to remain idle when this latter fails them. Those who are making progress, as well as those who are still more advanced in the ways of prayer, have need to know when they should pass on to effective prayer or to active contemplation, and how they should conduct themselves therein. Later on, should it please God to raise souls to different degrees of mystical contemplation, and this ought not to be of rare occurrence among religious, especially in a contemplative order, they will need to have a clear light thrown upon the road and an experienced guide to direct their steps. Otherwise the soul would be exposed to all kinds of illusions. This is what makes many promising beginners stand still upon the road, or keep performing the goose step upon the same spot without ever advancing. They have not a sufficient knowledge of this art of prayer, which should be the groundwork of their whole life. It would be inexact to say that the evil arises wholly from ignorance, for the weakness of the will has a great share in it, but ignorance is the primary pest, and, so to speak, a fundamental evil. It is true that good books treating of mental prayer abound and are in everybody's hands. Nevertheless, the greater number of authors hardly treat of anything but the method of prayer which is proper to beginners, and it is difficult to find a clear and precise explanation of the kinds of prayer which, without yet leaving the common ways, are suitable to souls more advanced. Many authors have, as it were, wantonly confused in this matter, which is, nevertheless, very simple. They have created a disconcerting confusion by their parallel descriptions of acquired contemplation and infused contemplation. They are a labyrinth, especially when there is a question of passing from the common to the more elevated ways of prayer. The authors have to be patiently studied, collated with and controlled by each other, in order to bring them into harmony, and to discern the truths amidst such various systems. A study so arduous has all that is required to repel even the best constituted minds. The author of this modest work thinks, therefore, he is rendering a helpful service to his brethren by offering them a clear, simple, and short explanation of all this matter, a little guide in the ways of prayer, a handbook wherein they will find practical counsels for all their needs, according as they advance in the common kinds of prayer, and even, should it so please God, in mystical contemplation, so that they will have always at hand, briefly stated, the information that they should otherwise have to seek for in 20 different books. This work is not presented as a scientific treatise, and contains nothing very new, except, perhaps, the order in which the subject is treated. The writer made use of all the treatises on prayer which he was able to procure. Sometimes he quotes them, sometimes he summarizes and combines them, and he has said hardly anything of his own, like a bee which goes pilfering from flower to flower, gathering its honey wherever it can find it. His sole desire is to excite souls to mental prayer, to recall to their mind the beaten tracks, as well as the less explored paths which lead to union with God, to put them in mind of the dispositions which secure success in prayer, of how they should conduct themselves in it, of the fruit they should draw from it, of the necessity of making perfection keep pace with prayer, and thus to give a fresh impulse in our order to the contemplative life, and by its means to those lofty virtues of which mental prayer is the best school. For it was in meditation that the psalmist warmed his heart and inflamed his soul with the fire of divine love. May God deign to bless this modest work, and communicate it to the grace to revive in many souls their zeal for mental prayer. This work is divided into 3 parts, in which we shall successively study prayer in general, ordinary prayer, and mystical prayer.